but you're very welcome to this second part of Change and Opportunity. And today we'll be focusing on a collective inhale. So Rod, I'll hand over to you for whenever you're ready to start.
Yes, we'll get started. So hello, everybody. Welcome to my shed in the garden and also to this second of two workshops that INTRAC is doing for Bond. So my name is Rod McLeod. I'm a principal consultant with INTRAC. For those who don't know, INTRAC is 30 years old. It stands originally for International NGO Training Research Center. So we are a support organization for civil society organizations. Everything we do is to strengthen civil society, which we do through a combination of consultancy work, training, research, publications. You can see on our website all around civil society issues. And Emma?
Hi, everyone. My name is Emma Almeris, and I am a senior OD consultant with INTRAC and joining Rod today to co-facilitate this session. Welcome.
Great. So if each of you could just briefly introduce yourselves in the chat, that would be great to say who you are and where you're from. You will have noticed that we are recording this session, so I hope that's okay with everybody. So why are we having these sessions? Obviously, the sector is in something of turmoil at the moment. Just about every conversation I have as part of work is related to people's funding issues, the pressures they are under, the changes they are considering. So there's a kind of sense of turmoil in the sector. Secondly, there's been a lot of questioning, not just this year, but in years leading up to this, about the role. What is the right role for INGOs in the sector? What is the legitimacy of us to act? What kind of role should we play? Localization, shifting power, decolonization. So these two things are coming together and leaving a lot of organizations wondering which direction they should turn in and what as a whole sector should we look like. So last week in the first session, which I think quite a few will have attended, we had some really, the exhale session, we called it. We had some very good discussions. Some of the key points that emerged were like, if you are having to phase something out, to acknowledge and celebrate the good work that was done, the importance of communicating during times of change to the extent of practically over communication, allowing space for staff to share their feelings and supporting each other through these sorts of processes. And there was a lot more besides. And at the end of this, we will do an email out which will contain a link where you can look at the first, both sessions, for the first session too, to get more of that. So that was exhale. Today we're talking about inhaling. So this is more about having gone through the process of made some hard choices, maybe close something, maybe merge something. How do you generate new inspiration, energy, and possibilities for the future? So in order to move forwards, what do we need to think about? How do we best make that happen in spite of the current challenges that we are all facing? Now, of course, you're all at different places in your organizations, and your organizations are probably quite different in nature from each other. So we're not pretending there's any single correct answer to any of these things. And in many ways, the glory of civil society is our diversity. And we're not looking for blueprint solutions, but hopefully we're looking to generate a few ideas, share a few experiences, and give some sense of positivity moving forwards. So I'll hand over to Emma, who's going to take the positivity forwards.
Thanks, Rod. So welcome again, everyone. As Rod was saying, I mean, the intention today is really to generate new inspiration, energy, and possibilities, and to think about how we can move forward in practice. And so today we'll be first starting out with our session agreements in terms of how it is that we want to be together in this space and to work together. We'll then explore some green shoots and what some positive examples are from the sector. And we'll be really interested in this part in hearing about some of the experiences and things that you've seen. We'll then be reflecting together on navigating change in turbulent times, and finally looking at practical tips and resources for re-energizing and finding possibility. So I think many of you participated in the previous session. I recognize many of your faces. So if you'll remember, we spoke about change and transitions often involving a loss of some kind, and it can trigger a lot of different emotions and often difficult emotions. So today, as we inhale together, we're really opening ourselves up to possibility. So in this space, we're inviting you to make this a non-judgmental space, to listen in order to understand. So letting go of having a pre-prepared response, to really prioritize curiosity over certainty and thinking about in this process what might be happening for you, but equally what might be happening for others. We invite you to take care of yourself and others in the way that you engage as well as the way that you interact. And know that at any time in the session today, you can opt out of any exercise if you need to. We'll be doing some breakout groups a bit later in the session. So if you decide that you don't want to join and you prefer to have time to reflect individually, you will have the option to opt out, and I can tell you a bit more about how that will happen later in the session. So again, the emphasis today is really about new possibilities. Many of us, I think, have come into last week's session and this week's session experiencing, as we've said, really turbulent times, probably a range of difficult emotions, including fear. But where those emotions exist, there is always hope. And it's a nice way to look at fear and hope as being two sides of the same coin. And so what we'll be talking about today is how you can ground yourself in possibilities and how that then is able to give you the confidence to take the next step. So the key question that we'll be exploring today is, how can our organizations move forward in challenging times? And one model that we found really useful in our work previously and in the scope of the discussion today has been the life cycle model of CSOs, which many of you will probably be familiar with. So looking at the curve from the left to the right on the screen, starting off at infancy, you often see at the start of an organization's life that it's spawned by a good idea and that it just needs a bit of help to take off. And then as it moves forward to being a teenager, the organization is much more dynamic and experimental. It can often be quite unstructured, is founder-led, and is at a time in its life where it is able to take a lot of risks in order to test out the parameters, its boundaries, how it wants to exist in the world. And then as it moves into its prime, you see organizations transitioning to a more distributed leadership model. So really moving away from that founder-led approach, with systems being set up, more innovation and its effectiveness starting to come into play. When it moves towards maturity, organizations are still very effective, but perhaps starting to be less innovative. And then in aristocracy, you can often see that the belief in self is stronger than the desire to change and evolve with new challenges. And as many of us know, at the bureaucracy phase, the organization can sometimes forget what it's there to do, and the focus can be more on procedure rather than results. And finally, at living death, the organization at this stage has become irrelevant and continues only because no one can be bothered to close it down. So I know that's quite a stark ending to the process, but I think we can all recognize through all of these stages that organizations grow and they develop, and sometimes they cease to exist. But there isn't necessarily an inevitability in the way that organizations grow and move downhill. And that's why at the top of the curve, you'll see the dotted line that represents the possibility of renewal. And so looking at this life cycle model, I think it'd be interesting if each of us took a moment to think about where our organization sits on this curve. Because I imagine that many of you are coming into this space today quite aware of where you are. And because the sector is changing so much, it's about navigating that change. So, as I said before, the focus today is really about renewal rather than decline, if that's the choice that we're making. So, it will be great, I think, if we can explore some green shoots today or some positive signs in the sector that are inspiring and that are giving us hope. So I'd like to speak to you about one example that I'm aware of with an organization called ADD International, which some of you may know. So the ADD is a funder for disability rights organizations. They've been piloting a participatory grant-making scheme in response to their analysis of the context and wanting to change themselves, but equally shape the sector and the way that things are done. They're not necessarily driven by cuts to official aid, but they believe that the recent decisions by donor governments validate their choice. So I think, as many of you will know, in participatory grant-making, decision-making power about funding sits with the groups it aims to serve. So it's really about getting the funds to those who are best placed to do the work, not just those who are good at applying for grants. ADD is a UK-based NGO, and they're being quite vocal about their transformational change that they want to go through. And this is in part as an accountability mechanism. So there then becomes a reputational risk if they aren't moving in that direction, which I think is quite a powerful thing to do. So in the broader context of all of the changes that have happened recently, I think this move towards decentralization and a decentralization of decision-making power, and also the localization of power is part of the shift that we've been talking about in the sector for a while, but that's really been, I think, emphasized and exaggerated about by the recent aid cuts. So I think ADD is a really good example of how an organization is choosing to renew in a changing sector and changing times. So at this point, we'd like to invite you to share your own examples of green shoots that you've seen or experienced. So I know that hopefully some of what we've been talking about so far will have sparked some ideas or made you think about something that you've seen or heard of. So we invite you to come off of mute, to put some ideas in the chat. And this is really just a space for each of us to share and hopefully to learn from one another.
Hi.
Rose has her hand up. Yeah.
Sorry, I can't see the hand. So Rod, if you wouldn't mind inviting people in, that would be great. Sorry, carry on, Ruth.
Thank you. I think it's going to sound a little bit like opposite to what you'd think was a green shoot, but I think because there's so much change going on, and as a change manager, I actually really like people's ability to resist and challenge. And I think actually a green shoot coming out of like the constant change and the change fatigue is that people are questioning leadership, they're questioning the way we do things, they're questioning changes that we're making. And I actually think that can be quite good because it makes us think deeply about what we are trying to achieve. I think people leaving to go and work in different places and things like that are making organisations sort of sit up and think, oh, maybe the way that we're doing things isn't working for our people. And even though it is probably a bit two-sided, not fully a green shoe, I do think it's quite, it's a time of like transition. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rose. Yeah, I think that's a really powerful example. I think sometimes green shoots can, as we're talking about today, come from really difficult times, and sometimes it forces us to face, I think, difficult decisions, but perhaps decisions that the organization has been reflecting on, but maybe hasn't felt courageous or brave enough to be able to face or to respond to. So that's a great example. Thank you so much for sharing. Is there anyone else who'd like to share any reflections or any examples of green shoots that they've seen?
I'm happy to share one, Emma.
Thanks, Lucy. Go ahead.
It's not, I guess, international development in the way that we have traditionally thought about it, but I'm really inspired by something called the Global Rights for Nature movement, which is about developing legal systems that recognise, respect and enforce rights of nature. And I think it's really interesting to broaden our frame when we're thinking about development. So like, who's included in that? What's included in that? Is it just people? Or actually, are we expanding our frame to think about ecosystems and the more than human world? So that's really inspiring me.
Thank you so much, Lucy. And it does feel like you're seeing more holistic responses in that regard, that people are perhaps looking less at how their work has historically been siloed and responding more to not only the changes in the sector, but I think also the fact that things do need to be looked at more holistically. Thank you. Would anyone else like to share? If not, then please do feel free to continue to add anything else in the chat if you'd like. Thank you, Caroline. Embedding localization via Help Age, which is part of the Help Age family. In Myanmar, which was well able to respond following the recent earthquake because it championed localization. Thank you. That's a great example.
I think just to add to that, if it's helpful, I think your framing of it as green shoots is really useful because I work for Age International and our journey around localization isn't always smooth, but I think the Age Myanmar example is a recent success story. And then countries like Ukraine, for obvious reasons, have found it hard to run with localization when they're just fielding so many challenges. And so they're less on that journey, but it's understandable because that's about their context. But we really saw in Age Myanmar the difference it made.
Yeah, I think that's a reflection that many organizations have started having and moving towards, but it's understandable that I think in different contexts, organizations are at different places in relation to that. But that's really helpful to think about. Thank you so much. Right. I will hand over to Rod for the next section. But again, if any of you do have anything else that you want to share, please do feel free to add it in the chat.
Great, thank you very much for that, Emma. And I was delighted to hear that last example about Help Age Myanmar, because I played some small role in the process whereby they were becoming an independent organization. And as a consultant, you often don't know what happens after you finish doing your consultancy, but the fact they were able not just to set themselves up, but to sort of carry on doing really good work is very encouraging. So I just want to have sort of 10 reflections on moving forwards, or perhaps relaunching in these difficult times. And these are just things that have come up through conversations we've been having with different organizations, what we've been reading, our experience in OD and change. And some of them overlap a bit with the kind of the session last week, and some of them you may have thought of, I'm sure will not be new to many of you. But anyway, these I like a list of top 10 things. So here we go. Top 10 things on relaunching yourselves in turbulent times. And it could be relaunching a new program, a new way of working, a new collaboration, or whatever. So first of all, of course, reaffirming your vision and mission. This is really going to the heart of why does your organization exist in the first place? What motivated people to come together as a civil society organization to organize themselves to do something? And so any decisions you make in relaunching, got to be thinking about how do we still achieve that change that we set out to in the first place. And that when you come to difficult decisions, I find it's very often very useful to come back. Let's just think about, we've got a dilemma here. Which direction do we go? The vision and mission, let's think about what we're trying to do. So which of these directions is more likely to achieve what we set out to in the first place? What Gandhi called his talisman when you're faced with alternative courses of action. And his talisman talked about recalling the face of the poorest, weakest person and assessing if what you're planning will be the benefit them. So the centrality of vision and mission. Secondly, you won't be doing this. You're not the first organization, if you are making substantial change, to do this. So in times of crisis, it's often that you've looked a lot inwards, but it's actually good to take the time to look outwards a bit, see what are others doing. There may be others like in Bond on this call or whoever, to look at how are they addressing these sorts of things. But also in the wider world, how have other people made these sorts of changes? And if you're having to phase out of some program or country or whatever, look at where this has happened previously. A few years ago, I did a bit of work in Malaysia, which was really interesting, looking at support to civil society there. And it was interesting because Malaysia had really stopped essentially having international aid about 25 years ago. It had got to middle income. And it was just fascinating to see what remained of civil society there. And obviously, a lot of the traditional stuff had suffered because they'd lost their INGO donors, they'd lost most other donors, and they're having to resource themselves locally. But it does show, we talk a lot about sustainability. What does sustain in contexts like that, like Latin America or wherever? And that can give you some inspiration about how then you can formulate your direction to enable that to happen in the future. Be ready to make the hard choices that might be necessary. If you're financially challenged, having to make cuts, that is a very difficult thing to do. I find personally that, I mean, to do that, it's good, very important first to set up the criteria by which you're going to take decisions, and then assessing against those criteria and using, to the extent of using matrix ranking. And that's not just good for helping focus you on the decision, but it's also good in helping in terms of explaining the decision. So I was asked by an INGO a couple of years ago to reduce from 16 countries where they were working to about 10. And it's obviously a very difficult and painful thing to do that. And we went through a process, and I wouldn't, obviously the countries which get cut, they're not going to be happy, and it has big implications on people, programs, and so on. But at least by going through that process in quite a rigorous way and having a lot of interviews to feed into that, it gives a solid basis. And I think by the end of it, people were accepting, if not necessarily happy about all of the outcomes. Thirdly, as I say, when you're going through times of crisis, it's very easy to become inward looking, but you have to recognize that what you do, and I assume as being part of Bond, everyone is INGOs here, affects others. It affects your partners, whether they're partners that you're supporting. In global majority countries, it affects other partners you're working with in a collaborative way. It affects communities. And you've got to think about how all of this is going to affect them and going to change them too. And it seems kind of obvious to say this, but from what I've observed, it doesn't always happen. And one INGO that I worked with a few years ago was talking about a big merger process between members of an international family. And when it came, I was asked to look at the whole partnership side for one of them, how they were working in partnership. And when it came to the final session with the CEO of the organization I was talking to, she said, it's funny, when we were going through all of our discussions about our global governance and so on, we never really considered partnership as an issue, which is quite an astonishing thing to say. But if that really is central to what we say that we're about, then we have to recognize how the changes that we make are going to affect others and try and think about their perspectives on this. Fifthly, they say never waste a good crisis, sometimes in politics. But it is an opportunity when you are making changes to deal with problematic areas. I mean, if you've got really problematic areas in your organization, presumably you would have dealt with them already. But it's kind of for those areas you kind of know are not great, but it's okay. So it sort of carries on year after year after year. This is a chance to address some nagging things that may be there and set things right. So it's difficult, it's painful, but it is an opportunity to make your organization leaner, meaner, more focused around your vision and mission. Sixth point, this is an opportunity. I mean, I know when you're faced, say, with financial issues, then the question can seem very much, okay, what do we cut back? But it's also an opportunity really to introduce new approaches that you may have been thinking or discussing. So when I talked about before, there's sort of twin things happening in the sector right now. There's the financial pressures that people are facing, but there's a lot of debate about what INGOs should look like in the future. This is where the two come together in a way. This is an opportunity to push issues like localization. I know of one INGO I'm involved with, which had an aspiration in its strategy to work more through partners, but it was making progress in quite a slow way. It's just decided to make much faster progress on that, to move more towards advocacy work as scaling up impact, but with lower resources frequently. Or it may be such things as forging new types of partnership, that rather than implementing things directly, you work more with through government, local government authorities on programs, or whatever other actors you might be collaborating with. So it is a chance to rethink and come up with a better way of working, not just a question of how do you make the budget balance. This one is a really difficult one. I think the seventh one, because it's kind of easy to say you need to strike the right balance. Who could disagree with you need to strike the right balance between responsible exit and new development work? So what I mean by this is INTRAC will argue a lot for, and that was included in the first session, when you're stopping something, you're stopping a partnership, exiting a country or whatever, you should do so responsibly. You shouldn't sort of continue your program full on and then come to a cliff and then everything stops. If you do that, things are not likely to be sustainable. So you need to kind of think about a phased plan for doing that, giving maximum chances for local or other actors to take over and take the work forwards. So that's important in itself. At the same time, you want to be developing the new the new organization, the new program to do that. And you want, ultimately, as an organization, if you are cutting things because of limited resources, probably you're tempted to spend a lot more on what you're doing for the future than rather than what you're ending. But both are important, and it's really important to think about what is the right balance in using your resources, not just money, but organizational time, effort, between those two elements, if you like. Eighthly, I mean, this again relates to the first one, but recognizing that change is a painful and confusing process. It's difficult for people having to make decisions in hard times, but it's hard for everybody involved. And I think in this sector, we often, our identities as people are bound up very frequently in the work that we do. So when you stop something, it's practically questioning it. And that's the work that I've been doing, say, for the past 10 years. It's practically questioning me as a person, my legitimacy, and what I've been doing, and you have to understand that. So I think that seems like quite a negative point, but I think in terms of successful relaunching, managing that well is extremely important. That you do the right things and you're seen to do the right things as an organization by people who are maybe suffering through the process. And linked to that, so ninth, once you're in the rebuilding phase, you've decided what to do, where your energies are going to be channeled. That is an opportunity to where new energies can be released. So there's a question of how often, if you're having to stop things and make changes as an organization, how long, what sort of time frame do you do that over? I'm sure that's some things that you may have been considering, and you don't want to rush it too much. As I say, responsible exit requires a considered process. But at the same time, if you think about it as a curve, you're going down in some senses when you're cutting things, you're cutting programs. But when you start relaunching, that's going up again. So once you get to that point, we say we've done the bad stuff, if you like, now it's building up for the good stuff. If that takes too long to get to that point, then the morale can just sink throughout the whole organization. So the sooner you can get to a rebuilding, relaunching, positive, this is where we're going, this is the new direction, then new energies can be released and a kind of rebirth can happen. So the final point, bringing it all together, is really leading and working through hope, not fear. There's a lot of fear around in the sector for what our organization is going to be doing. Will it exist next year? What's going to happen to my job? But also what's happening now is a new opportunity. We've talked so for so many years about promoting local civil society, about withdrawing ourselves in this is the opportunity to make that happen. How do we do that? The role of leadership is extremely important in bringing that about, setting the right tone, communicating extremely well. Also, there's a role for followership. And that was a very interesting point that Rose made at the start. How is one a good follower? I wrote a blog about it once, we can include in our resources, but a good follower is not someone who just agrees whatever the management says. And it's probably not someone who always disagrees whatever the management says too, but has a balanced approach of providing or asking the right questions, providing the resistance at particular points, but ultimately accepting also that changes have to be made and falling in and supporting those changes when the organization has reached that point. So in this kind of relaunching, if you like, this is a kind of risky time in some ways. You don't know how the new thing's going to work out, but at the same time, it's an exciting time potentially for an organization. And maybe when we look at that life cycle, we talked about those early years of infancy and adolescence, at that sort of stage, an organization may be a bit short on professionalism, but it's very big on energy, idealism, enthusiasm, and there is the opportunity to recapture that through your rebirth as an organization. So your ideas on how to help make this come about, I will hand back to Emma for the next part.
Thanks, Rod. So we'd like to invite you to reflect on what Rod just shared, some initial thoughts on moving forward in turbulent times. And as Rod just said, we'd now be interested in hearing from you regarding how we can put some of these ideas into practice. So to do this, we have 2 questions for you to reflect on. How do you lead from hope and not fear? And where can you find inspiration and new energies? And I just want to emphasize that any ideas at any scale are important. They don't need to be able to revolutionize or transform the entire organization. They can be small things that each of us do in our own practice. So all ideas are important. We've created a Padlet for you to document your reflections, which I'll drop into the chat shortly. And let me put the questions in the chat as well. And you'll be put into breakout groups. And when you are, we ask that you briefly introduce yourselves. So name, location, organization. If you would rather reflect individually, you are welcome to leave the breakout group and you will rejoin this main space. If you do choose to do that, if you could just put yourselves on mute, you're also very welcome to turn off your cameras. And then we'll come back to the space to share. I hope that you're able to have some good conversations in your groups. And thank you so much for adding some of the ideas into the Padlet. I'm sure that the discussions probably don't reflect everything that's in there, but it's great to see some of the examples that some of you have identified. So I see, for example, that Lucy spoke about noticing her own internal state and grounding herself if she starts to feel dysregulated and finding more spaciousness and ease in terms of how she leads from hope and not fear. I think a couple of people mentioned connecting with the purpose and the mission of the work and finding and drawing inspiration from that. And reference was made specifically to the humanitarian mindset. Graham, you talked about focusing on specific initiatives that make a difference and not spending all the time on internal change processes, which I can imagine is quite resourcing. There's someone who's named Wise Orca. Unfortunately, Padlet doesn't necessarily show everybody's name, but Wise Orca spoke about being and doing the thinking together, not being alone in this journey. Listening and engaging with others who have been on this journey, and acceptance that change is not easy, and putting in place coping mechanisms. Wise Orca, if you feel comfortable, would you like to come off of mute and talk a bit more about what these coping mechanisms are, or if you have any examples? equally, if you'd prefer not to talk, you're very welcome to share some examples in the chat. You also share that you imagine the future and what it would look like, create excitement that we are part of that change, talk about fears, and it's important to put them on the table and listen to fears. Listening to them are as important as keeping the hope one draws from the other. And I actually think that's a really important point, and one of the things that we've been talking about a lot at INTRAC in preparation for these sessions, but also in relation to our own journey as an organization, is that it's never just inhaling and then exhaling in a sort of linear way, but oftentimes, particularly in these times, we're finding that we're inhaling and exhaling repeatedly and almost at the same time. So it's not really just one or the other, but it's a living process. And I think that's important to recognize. Rose, yeah, sorry that you couldn't access the Padlet, but please do come in if you wanted to share what you were talking about.
Yeah, when I try and put a note in it, it just like comes up as a draft in the bottom. I can't get into the draft. So I can't write
so
it.
sorry.
It's all right. Yeah, we had quite a long discussion about that, about how some of the negative feelings are really important for the hope, and you've got to be in the right place to start to think about the hope side of it. So we put that you must process and value the negative responses in order to create a space for hope, because if you don't do that, the negative responses come in the hope phase and cause a lot of delays and challenges. But also you can, as a human, go from feeling hopeful one day to feeling quite negative the next, and we have to be kind to the human experience and say, it's okay to not be positive all the time, but you can still think about opportunity. And the other thing that one of the people in the call talked about was doing a big listening exercise. And I think that coming from a place of information and data, being informed and understanding the feelings of the organisation is really important, because then what kind of hope you can draw on. Are people in the right place for big picture hope, or do they just need some small quick wins day by day? Where are you people at, and coming from that informed position? If any of my group want to come in and say if I've missed anything, and we also talked about the passion that drives people into these organizations, means that if they're losing their organization or the way it's done, or even their job role, they're losing part of their identity and their purpose in life, and not just losing the job, because people don't go into it for those reasons. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much, Rose. I can see just by people's reactions on the screen that really speaks to so many of us. And I think, like you're saying, it is so important to acknowledge the human experience in all of this. It's not just about evaluating programs. It's not just about putting one foot in front of the other and moving forward, but it's acknowledging that it's a very complex experience that many of us are very personally tied to. So thank you so much for sharing from that group. That's really helpful. Well, we are nearing the end. So as we do, I just want to take us through one more exercise, and Rod will then take us to our close. So before we wrap up, I just wanted to invite all of you to take a few breaths and to center yourselves as we've traveled through this process together. I think many of you will have come into the space with concerns and facing challenges. I think many of us are at these times. And so it's really important to acknowledge these and then to find a way to release. So you're welcome to close your eyes if you'd like. And I invite you to take a deep breath in through your nose, exhale through your mouth. When you inhale, you're acknowledging what you're carrying with you. And when you're exhaling, you're letting go. As you continue to take deep breaths in and out, new space is created with each exhale. So again, when you inhale new possibilities and new energy. And when you exhale, you release. Thank you. Rod, if you'd like to take us towards our closing.
Yeah, thanks very much, Emma, and thanks everybody for all the ideas there. Some really great thoughts there, and hopefully all of this has helped people feel, even if you're going through difficult times, there is scope for positivity as your organisations undergo changes. We as INTRAC have found, I think we've been supporting organisational change for the past 30 years. Obviously now is a particularly stressed time in many ways, but we're prepared to offer everyone, if you're in the middle of a change process, would like support, we're offering 1 hour complimentary transition coaching call. So if you want to contact us and say what your particular issues are, we can decide who's best to work with you on a coaching call, or else a 30-minute call to explore how we might support you as an organization, you and your organization as you're making changes. So feel free to contact us on that email address if you'd like to have that support. It would also be great to have more examples of people with the green shoots. We've got some ideas and thoughts about how to create positive energy in organizations. Be really great to have thoughts on that. So feel free to communicate about that. We will, as I said at the start, be sending out an email with some resources and as well as links to these sessions that will be useful to you. And we'll want a survey at the end of this. So we're going to put the survey link up. If you could fill in the survey very quickly at the end as you're going from that. We've been a lot of the metaphor we've used is exhaling and inhaling. And although it's kind of artificial in a way, you practically have to do both at the same time. And I'm told that in order to play the bagpipes, you need to inhale and exhale at the same time. So best of luck to you all in learning to play the bagpipes and hopefully making a pleasant sound.